let me introduce you to a little bit of an icon. Hey everyone, I'm Carlo LaRosso from Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity. And in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Bowers & Wilkins 803 D4 loudspeakers. And these are part of their 800 series diamond collection. The video is going to be divided up into a few different segments. I'm going to start with talking about the design and the aesthetics of the loudspeaker. Then I'm going to go into the setup I used for my listening evaluation, some of the equipment used as well. Then I'll be talking about my listening impressions. Then I'll be touching on some bench press, some bench tests that were conducted on the speakers, and those will be available separately in written form along with the review. And then I'll be going into my overall impressions and conclusions about the speakers. I'd like to also say thank you to Bowers & Wilkins for extending me the courtesy to review these speakers. Like I said, I reviewed the previous generation a few years ago, and I was ecstatic when they offered me the opportunity to review the latest iteration of these black, insane-looking things from another planet. So, that being said, let's get underway, shall we? So in the introduction, when I called these things an icon, I wasn't half kidding. I think at this point, everyone and their brother and dog know that Bowers & Wilkins 800 series speakers have been used in some of the most prestigious recording studios in the world. So they have that distinct and deep pedigree to them as well. The 803 D4 themselves are the third model down in the 800 Diamond Series line, and they're also the smallest version that features this somewhat cycloptic-looking turbine head, as it's referred to. Aesthetically, these things are unmistakable. I mean, they're not wallflowers by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, look at it. It's especially, all in black. They're the Darth Vader of loudspeakers. I mean, you look at them and you practically expect them to start talking to you and say, "Luke, I am your father." Hide the background, they do not. Compared to the previous generation 803 D3s, these may look similar at first blush, but Bowers & Wilkins has made a number of evolutionary changes and improvements to the design that I'll be going through, along with the main points in the design of these pretty impressive loudspeakers. So beginning with the main enclosure of the 803 D4, you can see that it's definitely not a four-corner box. It is a artfully curved cabinet comprised of multi-layers of what appear to be beechwood ply, curved into this dramatic shape. This, of course, reduces the possibility of any sort of standing waves inside the cabinet, but it also makes for a very rigid external wall enclosure. The drive units are mounted at the widest point of the curvature. They do that by design because that's the stiffest area. It helps to resist mechanical resonances far better than on, say, a flat baffle. When we start getting to the internal bracing used inside the 803 D4, it's not simply just a matter of simple MDF braces or something like that. It's an extensive, what they call an enhanced matrix of interlocking panels, some out of wood, a large portion of it out of aluminum, to keep things extremely solid and rigid and reduce any sort of resonances at all. In that sense, these are some of the stiffest enclosures I've ever come across in a loudspeaker. Looking at where the bass drivers are physically mounted, each one is mounted inside what Bowers & Wilkins calls an aluminum bass pod that's clamped into a fixed aluminum plate inside the enclosure as part of that enhanced matrix bracing structure. And touching upon those bass drivers for a moment, the 803 D4 features dual 7-inch bass drivers whose cones are made from a material that Bowers & Wilkins calls aerofoil. Imagine, if you will, a sandwich of a middle layer of foam that's inserted between two layers of carbon fiber, and that creates the aerofoil cone material. New to the 803 D4 is that the top of the enclosure, instead of being wood, now has a solid aluminum top plate that's been added for extra rigidity for the overall enclosure structure. This top plate also has actually a very nice black leather trim running all over the top of it. Aesthetically is very pleasing looking, and it's very nice to the touch. As with the previous generation model, the 803 D4 features that unmistakable turbine head that houses the mid-range driver. The turbine head itself is cast completely out of aluminum. Aesthetically it's beautiful, and it's an amazing piece of engineering in and of itself. The 5-inch mid-range driver cone is made from a composite material B&W calls Continuum, which carries over from the previous generation speaker. What is new about the mid-range driver this generation is that the traditional fabric spider is replaced with this new high-tech contraption you see, which they call a biomimetic suspension. As the mid-range driver is working, a traditional cloth spider, because of its design, has the potential of acting almost like a second diaphragm, creating unwanted output that muddies up the sound. Cloth spiders are also much less linear in their travel and can get more so over time, causing unwanted distortions. Bowers & Wilkins claims the new biomimetic suspension technology, say that fast 10 times over, effectively takes care of both those concerns. If you look closely at the mid-range driver, you will notice this aluminum trim around the edge. And if you just gently tweak that a little bit, you can see that the mid-range driver that's attached to it is decoupled from the turbine head as well. You will get an impression that there's a lot of decoupling going on with the 803 D4. Lots and lots of decoupling is to be had. The turbine head is completely decoupled from the main enclosure using special silicone mounts. The mid-range driver, as I already mentioned, is decoupled from the turbine head itself, and so too is the new longer tweeter housing, which I will get to in a moment. And now we get to the 1-inch diamond dome tweeter, which carries over from the previous generation speaker. And we're not simply talking about diamonds impregnated into some other material to make up the dome. The tweeter dome itself is completely constructed from laboratory-grown diamonds. And take that, Tiffany's. The new cone assembly, which is about twice the length of the tweeter cone assembly on the previous generation, on the D3. The one on the D4 is a full 12 inches long. This long piece is milled from a solid block of metal. The new longer tweeter pod is said to help lower total harmonic distortion farther down in the tweeter's frequency range, thereby allowing it to sonically better mate with the upper end of the mid-range. Turning to the back of the speaker, there is this insanely cool-looking Art Deco-ish aluminum spine, this ribbed aluminum spine that runs the full length of the back of the speaker. It's just beautiful to look at. It looks like a piece of Art Deco sculpture back here. And at the very bottom are four very pretty looking and substantial speaker binding posts. The 4 binding posts are suitable for bi-wiring and bi-amplification. Bowers & Wilkins conveniently includes a pair of jumpers in case you just have regular old 2-wire speaker cable. I use the 803 D4s in 2 different rooms in my house. The first is my large studio space, which measures 23.5 by 35 feet with 7-foot ceilings. The speakers were placed just over 8 feet apart. The listening position was 10 feet apart from the center point between the speakers. The speakers were just slightly towed in so that if you drew a line from the tweeters, they would converge at a point well past the listening position at 10 feet away. Some of the equipment used in the studio space We'll start with the Technics SL1200 Mark VI turntable, customized by KAB Electroacoustics, sitting on an isoacoustic Delos isolation stand. Then we have the Technics SUR1000 integrated amp, which is also in for review. Here's the Benchmark Media System stack with the HPA4 preamp, DAC3B, and AHB2 power amp. This is my homemade Raspberry Pi endpoint, root endpoint. And here's the topping D90 SE DAC and the GearFab Audio D-Bob digital breakout box. And here's the Anthem STR preamp and power amp, which you'll see in a few seconds. The digital front end for discs is the Oppo BDP 105D universal player. And that pretty much sums up the equipment. The cables in this room are by Blue Jeans cable and Claris cable. The home theater room measures 13.5 feet by 18 feet with 7.5 foot ceilings. It's a well-treated room featuring acoustic treatments from GIK Acoustics. Both absorption and a little bit of diffusion are used in here, along with a pair of bass traps. The speakers are positioned 7 feet apart, very slightly toed in. The main listening position was 8.5 feet away from the center point between the speakers. The speakers were also set up 2.5 feet from the side walls and 3 feet from the front walls. The equipment used in the home theater room consists of the following. Yes, that's a fully functioning Pioneer Kuro 50-inch plasma TV, and it still looks fabulous. The disc player is an Oppo BDP 103 universal player. We also have a Zedu Neo Alpha high-def player streamer in the house for review. And yes, that is a fully functioning Pioneer CLD D704 Laserdisc player, because I am still one of those people. And here we have the Anthem MRX 1120 AVR. And we also use a Microsoft Xbox One, so streaming from the video channels, Netflix, Amazon Prime, yada, yada, yada. One thing I wanted to get out of the way up front is that when I reviewed the previous generation of these speakers back in 2017, the D3s, I found that the speakers themselves were kind of fairly particular about setup. They were a little fussy in my experience in my rooms. I had set them up in my larger studio space to begin with, and while I was experimenting with placement, I found that I was either getting really good bass response and so-so imaging, or really pinpoint imaging and not so great bass response. So, I ended up settling in that room for the really good imaging and the bearable bass response. After a while, I then brought them in here in my home theater space and set them up, and I found that they just gelled with this room really well. I was able to position them to where I got really razor sharp imaging and really good bass response. The one thing about that review a few years ago that I kind of feel like I gave a little short shrift to those speakers was that at the time I was just getting comfortable with understanding speaker measurements and starting to do some basic ones. And I took the average in-room response measurements of those speakers, the D3s, in my studio space, set up for really good imaging and not so great bass response. So that really didn't give, I feel, a proper indication of what those speakers are capable of. So this go around with the D4s, I wanted to see if they had the same sort of idiosyncrasies as the last generation speakers did. And sure enough, when I placed them in the studio space, either great imaging or great bass, but neither did the two meet in there. So brought them in here, same story as the previous generation. They just loved this room, and I got perfect imaging, razor sharp, and really great bass response. So to that end, when you get to the bench test section and you see the bench tests separately in print, you'll notice that the average in-room response measurement was taken in this room to give a reader a better sense of what the speakers are capable of bass-wise when properly set up in a room. The rest of the measurements, the near-field ones done at 1 meter, were done in the studio space because it's much larger and I'm able to position the speakers farther away from any walls or reflective surfaces that might interfere with the measurements and how the microphone, reads the speaker. So I just wanted to give that little point of clarification. And now we get to my listening impressions of the Bowers & Wilkins 803 D4 loudspeakers. In my review of the previous generation of these speakers, I said that they were very much like surgical instruments, and very much the same thing applies to this latest generation, the D4s as well. Very hyper-detailed, very precision imaging when they're set up properly. Well-recorded orchestral music, I could easily pick out the different instrument sections, down to the soloists, down to, very specific sound cues in the soundstage. When the recording space is well captured, the speakers are very much revealing of many spatial cues of the recording environment. That becomes it reveals them in almost very scary detail. They're really quite that good. The Diamond Tweeter does a fantastic job with just getting the subtlest nuances out of instruments. Flutes, harps just sound absolutely beautifully rendered. Great little details of guitar strings, shimmer of cymbals, just the slightest, subtlest details come out in really pinpoint accuracy. I mean, you'll get that sensation that you're hearing tons of little details for the first time, or that you didn't notice as much in previous listenings when you're listening to your favorite music. The mid-range in these speakers sounded very balanced. Vocals sounded very present, full, rich, very detailed. I would, if anything, I think these speakers, because of their extra bit going on with the treble or the air, I guess, with the detail and stuff, on occasion it made me want to say that maybe the mid-range is a little bit reserved, but I don't really think so. I think the mid-range on these speakers is nicely balanced. I think that all that extra detail and extra energy I'm hearing in the treble region is possibly making me feel like the mid-range is not quite in balance, but I'm sure it is. I think what we have with these speakers is an extra little oomph with the with the treble and the air and the detail and stuff. The treble in a comparable American speaker like the Revel F328BE and even the F228BE, the treble is definitely a little more laid back, but the mid-range and treble themselves are extremely well balanced. It just gives you a different sort of sound signature. Another comparable speaker like, say, the Perlison S7T, again, mid-range and treble very balanced, very linear. These definitely have these Bowers & Wilkins definitely have a lot more treble energy and a higher sense of detail than either of those speakers have. One is not necessarily better than the other per se. I think it really comes down to a matter of taste and what your personal preferences are. The bass is in this room, set up properly, the bass is absolutely phenomenal. It hits deep, it hits hard, and it's also incredibly detailed. You get well-recorded drums, and you will hear nuances in the sounds of the drum skins, the pitch of different bass drums and different drum hits are just become almost shockingly obvious. It's really quite interesting to hear well-recorded drums on these speakers. Piano sounds really lovely on these speakers as well. They do piano incredibly well, especially the lower register notes. They just hit with weight and authority to them. It's just really, really well done with these speakers. Some of the particular tracks and music that I used in my listening evaluations that stuck out with me when I was listening to the Bowers & Wilkins 803 D4. First one is from the Speed of Heat album by Jeff Skunk Baxter. Brand new album, former guitarist of Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers. The opening track on the album, Ladies from Hell, great sounding title, great sounding track. You know, very expansive on these speakers. There are some opening synthesized bass notes, or bass hits, I should say, that I guess are made to mimic a drum or a timpani. Just sound really solid and impactful through these speakers. I mean, you kind of feel it in your gut when those drum hits happen. There's also a section in that song with a great, I don't know if it's a resonator guitar or a National Steel guitar that he's using, but just the slide work that he does on it, just the shimmer and those steel strings and the sound of the resonator in that guitar, it just fills the room, but it's so detailed and so it just slightly nasty sounding, but it comes across really, really well with these speakers. He does a cover of Steely Dan's My Old School, definitely a little more upbeat than the original, but great sounding as well. And there's a section of the song where they sing that line, you know, California tumbles into the sea, and it's done with almost like sort of a Beach Boys style sort of surf, I don't want to say a cappella, but medley with like a number of singers, and it just like is just so wide and deep sounding in this room coming from these speakers. And you could definitely tell that instead of sort of one kind of blurry mass of singers, it's like multiple very specific voices or layers of a voice in a track that you could hear. So, you know, it's just a great sounding, very detailed representation of those bits in those tracks. So for classical music, one of my go-to SACDs is the classic film scores of Bernard Herrmann. And on this SACD, there is a track called Descending and the Undersea Forest, and it's taken from the movie Beneath the 12-Mile Reef. So this particular track involves 9 large orchestral harps, and as the track starts off, you start with one harp on the left channel, and it makes like a dun 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 sound, almost mimicking, I guess, gently flowing water, if you want to describe it that way. But you start with one harp on the left channel, and then a second one comes in, does its thing, and the third one comes in, and so on and so forth, until you have, from left to right, 9 harps playing at the very end. And just the just the specificity of each harp as it comes in, as rendered by these speakers, was phenomenal. I could picture exactly in space as each one of these harps came in, and not just, again, from left to right, but they would come in, and it's almost like a little bit of a curve. So it's like, starts to the left, second one comes in a little farther back, and then the center, and then the ninth one comes in closer. So there's a good deal of depth to that image as each one of those harps came in. It's a great sounding track, and a really, really neat, and it just, again, hyper specific with these speakers. It was very cool to listen to. And of course the sounds of the harps were just phenomenal, and with harps of those sizes you get some really, really deep notes, and beyond just the lovely tinkling high notes. And these speakers just milked those deep notes for plucks for all they were worth. I mean, you could feel those plucks, and you can hear those deep notes and feel them. So it really was a great bit of music to listen to with these speakers. So to sample a little jazz, I played a favorite recording of mine, which is by Stan Getz, called Getz a Go-Go, which was recorded live in 1964. Great sounding recording. The funny thing is, this recording is, characteristically really warm and really I won't say dark, but definitely sort of rich and warm sounding. And it's funny, these Bowers & Wilkins speakers kind of, brightened it up a little bit, which was kind of nice to hear. Not overly or sort of offensively or anything like that, or they weren't overly ruthless with it, but just the little extra energy in them in detail just kind of brightened up the overall sound a little bit, which was a nice touch. The opening song Corcovado was just absolutely beautiful. The female singer Astrud Gilberto, really unique sounding voice, just sort of, it's a slightly sort of offbeat or off kilter, I guess, sort of sound to it, but it just sounds, trust me, it's beautiful sounding. Her voice is just really beautiful sounding. And on these speakers, it was just very smooth, very detailed, perfectly centered in the soundstage. Very, very, very nice. And of course, Stan Getz tenor sax just sounded, again, smooth, but vibrant and musical. It just had those, those great tones that you'd associate with that instrument. Really clear, and just very, very nice sounding. Another track I really like is the telephone song, and I mentioned those little details that these speakers just love to punch out. I was able to hear Kenny Burrell plays acoustic guitar on, and I could definitely hear him a little more noticeably than I've heard him in previous times I've listened to this track on the left channel. There's a cowbell and the cymbals on the right. I could definitely make out a little more than usual, which is really neat. Neat little bits and pieces you hear. And again, Miss Gilberto's voice just sounded so phenomenal and just so rich and pure on that track. It was just great. The soundstage was, again, really wide, and you can make out some of the details of the recording area, the recording venue. Just a great sounding recording and song. Not all rock and roll or metal sounded incredibly fantastic with these speakers, just because not all of it is incredibly well recorded. But for something heavier, I tried Tool's Fear Inoculum album on these speakers, streamed it off Qobuz, and the instrumental track Chocolate Chip Trip, it just sounded incredible on these speakers. It's a drum percussion instrumental track, and it just sounded so powerful on these. There's an opening panning sequence that's sort of repeated near the end, and it's not just a left to right pan of just percussion and drums and stuff, but it goes in a complete circle, like not just a tight circle around the speakers, a full circle around the room. So from the front to the side to behind me, and then around the back and back to the front again, and it just kept repeating this over and over, and it was just so, the panning and the motion of those drums and percussion was just so clearly defined by these speakers in this room. It was something else. I hadn't quite heard it that detailed and that specific before until this time listening to these Bowers & Wilkins speakers in here. I know I keep wanting to say B&W, I'm sorry. Old habits die hard. But and just the drumming on that track, just, I mentioned how detailed the bass was in my listening note overview at the beginning, but this particular track, you just could hear the pitch of the different drum skins and the hits, and it's not just like one particular thud, thud, thud. It was just, you heard those different pitches and textures of the drum impacts and the hits on the skins and everything else going on. It was something else. That bass area is just so detailed sounding. You really could pick out all this neat little stuff, and just the intensity of that track is phenomenal. It is just unyielding, and the speakers played it without any sort of distress, compression, noticeable distortion, whatever you want to call it. They just played it cleanly and loud, and just so accurately and specifically. It was just a ball to listen to. Because of the nature of these speakers and how revealing and extremely detailed they are, it should be pretty obvious that you don't want to play crap recordings on these speakers. Just don't even bother. It won't help them. You know, playing them on these speakers will not magically transform a poorly recorded piece of music. It will reveal every single flaw times 10. These will make a bad recording sound worse. So feed them good stuff. One other thing you might want to consider is that if you're an avid vinyl listener, you may want to take a close look at the pairing of your phono cartridge that you're using with these speakers. I tested a number of cartridges that I had on hand with on my turntable with these speakers, and I tended to notice that cartridges that had that were voiced with a tipped up high end or a slightly more exaggerated high end, I found to be not a very good match with these speakers. It just made the high ends, the upper mids and the highs just like really a little too much. Things got very edgy and slightly abrasive. Whereas when I paired them with cartridges that were, you know, a more linear response, it sounded much better. The pairing worked out much more favorably with these with the 803 D4s. Some examples were, I used the Audio-Technica 760 SLC. That one was not a good match to my ears. I had the Sumiko Celebration 40 here with these speakers, and that's a very heavily voiced cartridge, and with these speakers it was not the best sort of mix, the best sort of match that could be had. Cartridges that did work, for example, the Audio-Technica OC9 ML/2. That's a very linear cartridge. It sounded great with these speakers. The Ortofon 2M Black, perfect match with these speakers. It sounded really crisp and detailed, but not fatiguing in any sense, in any way. Audio-Technica VM540 ML was also a good match. And I have a Shure M97XE cartridge with a Gico SAS stylus attached to it, and that also sounded very, very good with these speakers. That was an excellent match as well. So again, as razor sharp and slightly unforgiving as these speakers are, I would definitely keep into consideration the type of phono cartridge you are using, just to make sure you get a good overall component match with them. To find the bench tests for the Bowers & Wilkins 803 D4, if you're watching this video on the Secrets website, the bench tests are located just below the video in printed form. If you're watching this video on the Secrets YouTube channel, there will be a link just below the video that will take you to our website and the review, and you can find the bench tests just below this video on our website. So in conclusion, as I said in the beginning of this review, if any loudspeaker line should properly be considered an icon, it is the Bowers & Wilkins 800 Diamond series, and the 803 D4 faithfully carries on that tradition, both in sound quality, build, and design. It is an absolute work of art in every respect. From standpoint of design and engineering, they look like nothing else out there. They look and feel every bit of the $22,500 per pair asking price. They are available in 4 different finishes, and as you see here, the all gloss black finish totally fills out the something wicked this way comes motif very effectively. In operation, they loved having a good powerful amplifier to run them, like my Anthem STR or the Vera Audio amplifier while it was here. But, you know, conversely, my Anthem MRX 1120 receiver powered them just wonderfully. And so did my benchmark AH-B2 amplifier, and they're roughly both about 100 and some odd watts of power, give or take. When set up well, these speakers have razor-sharp imaging and are incredibly precise and detailed sounding. They also throw a heck of a soundstage, both from left to right and from front to back. The depth and width of the image they throw out is truly remarkable. Again, when set up properly in room, the bass response of these Bowers & Wilkins 803D4 was absolutely fantastic. It was extended, reached very deep, hit very hard, and sounded incredibly detailed with music and movies. The mid-range sounded very balanced, effortless, easy to listen to. Vocals on the whole sounded very enjoyable and very coherent. The treble response is extended, very energetic, and very, very detailed. In fact, the extended detail and precision of the sound of these speakers pretty much brings up my only potential criticism. If you are at all sensitive to the extended treble energy that the 803D4 put out, they may not necessarily, be the speakers for you. They are incredibly detailed and revealing to the point of being borderline ruthless. They will not do poorly recorded music any favors. So unless you feed them well-recorded material on a consistent basis, do not expect them to smooth over any rough edges of some of your lower quality recordings. They will not be merciful to any degree on that regard. And the other point being as well, if you are a vinyl listener, and like I said, if you happen to have phono cartridges that have a tipped up or an extended treble response, again, those may not be a great component match for these speakers either. So that is also something else to consider. At the end of the day, though, I think the Bowers & Wilkins 803D4 are an incredible pair of speakers that are worthy to be sought out and listened to, regardless of whether you are seriously in the market for them or not. If nothing else, just to listen to them to get a point of reference of their sound. If you love a super detailed sounding speaker that's almost scalpel sharp precise, or you're already a devotee of the Bowers & Wilkins sound, you will undoubtedly love these speakers. So with that being said, thanks so much for watching. If you see this video on our YouTube channel, please click like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please frequent the Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity website for the latest in reviews and content as we update our website regularly. And thank you so much for watching. All the best to you.